Welcome to another episode of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, a podcast that unearths the forgotten corners of history and brings them back into the light. Each episode goes beyond headlines and textbook dates into the places, decisions, and moments that helped shape our world, even if they were left off the official record. These stories are built from archives, old photographs, and the physical traces still etched into the landscape. Here's your host, photographer, historian, and the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer.
Today on episode 4 of the Field Guide, we're uncovering a Cold War secret buried under spring rain, one that soaked the streets of Troy, New York, and the rest of the capital region with something far more dangerous than water. This episode is the expanded audio companion to my article on Restoration Obscura, The Fallout That Fell as Rain. You can find that on restorationobscura.com. This episode is personal. I first read Bill Heller's A Good Day Has No Rain back in 2005. At the time, I was a student of history, but also a local, a Trojan. I grew up hearing stories that sounded like urban legends, the kind of tales you swap after too many late nights spent watching monster movies. Stories about a storm that wasn't like any other storm. It was the perfect kind of legend for a kid growing up in the Cold War in the time of Chernobyl, a time when the world already felt wired with silent, invisible dangers. We lived with the idea that disaster could fall from the sky without warning. Sirens could sound in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. A flash of light on the horizon could mean the end of everything. In that kind of world, the idea of a storm carrying something more than rain, something you couldn't see, something you wouldn't even know was there, didn't just sound possible, it sounded inevitable. At first, it felt like just another piece of local folklore, like the haunted house at the corner of Oneida and Genesee, or the abandoned hospital where strange things were said to happen after dark. It had the same pulse of mystery that fascinated kids who spent half their lives in the worlds of science fiction and video games. But this story was different, because this storm was real. And when it rolled through Troy, New York, it didn't just bring rain, it brought radioactive fallout, drifting down from a bomb detonated thousands of miles away, invisible and unannounced, soaking into the streets, the soil, and the lives of everyone it touched. As kids, we passed these legends around without context, not really believing them, not really questioning them. Then I read the book. Heller's research peeled the lid off one of the most chilling episodes in Troy's history, an event most people never knew happened. Through those pages, the rumors I grew up hearing hardened into facts. It wasn't myth, it wasn't speculation, it was real. When I published my first article about the Troy fallout on Restoration Obscura, I wasn't prepared for the response. Neighbors, strangers, even former classmates reached out. Some said they had always suspected something was off. Others shared tales of unexplained illnesses or warnings to stay inside during a rainstorm, warnings that came with no explanation. One person told me that their grandmother had always believed something fell from the sky in the 1950s, but no one took her seriously. And above all, what I heard most was disbelief. Disbelief that the story hadn't been told. Disbelief that it wasn't taught in schools. Disbelief that a public health disaster of this magnitude had slipped through the cracks of collective memory. Let's rewind to April 1953. A test known as Shot Simon was detonated at the Nevada test site. It was part of Operation Upshot Knothole, one of the many series of atmospheric nuclear tests carried out by the United States in the 1950s. This particular detonation clocked in at 43 kilotons, about 3 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Now, most people assumed that these tests were a Western problem, that the danger stayed out in the desert, but nuclear fallout doesn't obey geography. The radioactive debris launched into the upper atmosphere doesn't simply drift downward and vanish. It moves, it travels, it enters the jet stream, and it rides the wind. What that means is this: fallout from a test in Nevada could drift thousands of miles east before ever coming back to Earth. All it needs is the right storm. And that storm came to Troy. April 27th, 1953, a spring rain swept over the city. It smelled like any other rain. fresh, earthy, familiar. Kids played in puddles, shoppers moved between awnings, families settled in for a gray afternoon. No one suspected that they were being bathed in radioactive isotopes: strontium-90, cesium-137, iodine-131. The residue of a bomb detonated thousands of miles away. At Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, physics professor Herbert Clark was conducting a routine lab with his students. The plan was simple: calibrate Geiger counters, get baseline readings, basic instrumentation. The Geiger counters registered radiation at levels far above normal. Clark assumed a malfunction. He reset the equipment. Still high, he had his students test different areas. Something was wrong. Clark and his students collected rainwater samples. When the lab results came back, they showed 270,000 picocuries per liter, an astonishing number. To put that in perspective, the federal drinking water limit for strontium-90 back then was just 60 picocuries per liter. The rain in Troy measured 4,500 times higher, more radioactive than what many European cities saw after Chernobyl. Clark immediately alerted the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC. What he expected was action, urgency, and investigation. What he got was silence. Days passed. When the AEC finally arrived, they dismissed Clark's data. Their own tests showed levels 20 times lower, with no real explanation why. There was no warning issued to the public, no health advisories, no cleanup. But here's the twist. Eastman Kodak, yes, the film company, had been warned. Years earlier, they had complained that radioactive fallout was fogging their photographic paper. So the government quietly agreed to notify Kodak before future tests. That way, they could protect their film stock. So Kodak's film was protected. The people of Troy were not, and neither were the communities of the capital region. That arrangement was later confirmed in Senate hearings. It wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was a policy. The Kodak Agreement, as it's now known, represented a disturbing threshold, the moment when secrecy and industrial favoritism clearly outweighed public safety. The science of fallout is complex, but it can be explained in simple terms. When a nuclear bomb explodes, the heat and energy released create an enormous updraft, forming a mushroom cloud. This column of air pulls debris and radioactive particles miles into the sky. The lightest isotopes, like iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90, can reach the stratosphere, and once they're up there, they become part of the atmosphere. They're carried by high-altitude winds, often circling the globe. These particles don't fall evenly. Instead, they return to Earth through precipitation, snow, mist, or, as in Troy's case, rain. This is where the danger truly compounds. Rain concentrates those particles, gathers them into droplets, and deposits them onto the earth below. Roofs, sidewalks, gardens, into the river, into crops, and critically, into people. Strontium-90 is chemically similar to calcium. To the human body, they are virtually indistinguishable. When ingested through contaminated food, water, or even inhaled dust, strontium-90 enters the bloodstream and is deposited in bones and teeth, particularly in growing children. Once embedded, it irradiates bone marrow from within, increasing the risk of leukemia and bone cancers. This radioactive isotope has a half-life of nearly 29 years, meaning its presence lingers not just for decades, but often for generations within the ecosystem and within the human body. Iodine-131 behaves differently, but with no less danger. It zeroes in on the thyroid gland, especially in children whose small glands absorb proportionally higher doses. It was detected in milk supplies across the country in the 1950s and 60s, with children consuming it daily. The result? A marked increase in thyroid nodules, cancers, and autoimmune disorders. The National Cancer Institute later estimated that exposure to iodine-131 from above-ground nuclear testing could be responsible for between 11,000 and 212,000 cases of thyroid cancer in the United States. Then there's cesium-137. It mimics potassium, spreading throughout the body's soft tissue. It lodges in muscles, organs, and reproductive systems, continuously emitting radiation with a half-life of over 30 years. Once incorporated, these isotopes do not simply pass through the body, they become part of it, integrated into the skeleton, glands, and cells, releasing their ionizing energy with every breath, heartbeat, and cell division. Unlike an explosion that leaves behind a crater, shattered glass, and the clear scars of violence, fallout is a quiet predator. It doesn't tear down buildings. It corrupts the body from within. It alters DNA, misfires replication, and hides behind latency periods of 10, 20, even 30 years. The people of Troy didn't see it. They drank the water, breathed the air, ate the food grown in local soil. They went about their lives as the danger settled invisibly around them, soaked into their yards, rooftops, and bloodstreams. We know now what the government refused to acknowledge then, that fallout from tests like Shot Simon caused real, measurable harm. Independent epidemiological studies conducted in the decades since have shown clear increases in leukemia, thyroid disease, breast cancer, multiple myeloma, and other illnesses in populations living downwind of U.S. nuclear test sites. A 1997 National Cancer Institute report linked milk-borne iodine-131 exposure to elevated cancer rates in nearly every state in the continental U.S. And still, Troy was forgotten. There were no public health surveys, no state or federal monitoring programs, no follow-up studies, no explanations for why. The medical records told one story, the soil and rain told another, but the government told nothing at all. The Cold War wasn't just a conflict of ideologies, it was a test of national will, of limits. What would a country do to maintain strategic dominance? What would it hide to preserve public confidence? Who would it sacrifice to continue building the most powerful weapons in human history? The people of Troy were not alone. The people of the Marshall Islands were irradiated and displaced by over 60 tests in the Pacific. Those downwind of Utah, where fallout caused livestock miscarriages and community-wide cancer spikes. The sheep ranchers of Nevada, whose herds dropped dead in the fields after atomic clouds passed overhead. The difference is their stories were eventually told, if only in part. Troy's wasn't. In the next section of this episode, we'll explore the broader implications, how fallout was tracked, how communities across the U.S. responded, and how Kodak's accidental detection of fallout led to one of the strangest alliances in Cold War history. Let's talk about tracking fallout. In the early 1950s, the science of radioactive fallout was in its infancy, but it wasn't non-existent. The U.S. government had a working knowledge of the physics involved. They understood that nuclear detonations released particles into the upper atmosphere, and they were well aware those particles didn't simply vanish. Fallout traveled, it moved with the weather, and it didn't respect borders. Behind closed doors, the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, and its affiliated national labs, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Argonne, had begun building a sprawling infrastructure to monitor fallout. Radiation was being measured in soil, surface water, milk, and vegetation across the continental United States. Observation posts dotted the West, Midwest, and even the East Coast. The U.S. Public Health Service participated, so did the Weather Bureau. The data was there, and it was growing. But whether planners fully understood the scale of radioactive drift or simply chose not to acknowledge it remains a murky question. The truth likely lies somewhere in between science and strategy. The working assumption at the Nevada test site was that most dangerous fallout would settle within a 300-mile radius. This belief was drawn from early, lower-yield tests and from simplistic atmospheric models that failed to account for seasonal weather shifts or the jet stream's high-speed transport. Military and civilian leaders leaned on this assumption heavily. It gave them plausible deniability, but reality didn't wait for permission. As early as 1951, monitoring stations began detecting elevated radiation levels in places that shouldn't have been affected: Iowa, New York, Ohio, and even southern Canada. These weren't marginal readings. They showed that radioactive particles had traveled hundreds and eventually thousands of miles from ground zero. And then came the Kodak incident. In 1951, photographic film produced at Eastman Kodak's Rochester plant began showing mysterious fogging, chemical interference consistent with ionizing radiation. Their scientists traced the problem back to the corn husks used as packaging material. Those husks had been harvested in Iowa. The source? Fallout from a nuclear test in Nevada. This discovery could have sparked a national alarm. It didn't. Instead, it sparked a deal. The government quietly agreed to notify Kodak in advance of upcoming tests. That way, the company could take protective measures to safeguard its film stock. It was a private concession to a powerful industry, proof that the government acknowledged the far reach of fallout, even as it continued to tell the public that there was nothing to worry about. This arrangement, now referred to as the Kodak Agreement, remained secret for years. It wasn't just about film, it was about liability. Kodak had the resources to sue. Ordinary citizens did not. Meanwhile, scientists at institutions like Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute were operating in the dark. People like Herbert Clark weren't included in federal radiation networks. They weren't warned about upcoming tests. They weren't told to expect fallout. And so, when Clark's Geiger counters began screaming during that April 1953 rainstorm in Troy, he assumed it was a mistake, a fluke, until it wasn't. His readings, 270,000 picocuries per liter, were 4,500 times higher than what the government then considered safe. He reported it. The Atomic Energy Commission responded by sending in its own team, whose results came back 20 times lower. Case closed, no warnings, no advisories, no mention of Kodak. The truth by then had been quarantined. By 1953, the idea that fallout could be contained in the West was untenable. Meteorological data, some of it publicly available, some of it locked in classified files, showed how upper atmospheric winds could carry radioactive particles across the country in a matter of days. The jet stream acted like a conveyor belt, delivering invisible contamination from the Nevada desert to the farmlands of Iowa, the suburbs of New Jersey, the rivers of upstate New York. By the 1960s, fallout had gone global. Government-sponsored studies confirmed that radioactive isotopes from U.S. nuclear tests had been detected in rainwater in Europe and Asia. Strontium-90 and cesium-137 showed up in baby teeth collected from children in St. Louis and Stockholm alike. In the United States, the government launched milk monitoring programs, collected environmental samples, and built fallout shelters, but still kept much of its data secret. Information was siloed. Agencies refused to share findings with one another. Local health departments were kept out of the loop. The average citizen remained unaware that the rain falling on their roof or the milk poured into their child's cereal might be laced with radioactive isotopes. And even when radioactive rainfall reached lethal concentrations, as it did in Troy, the official response was damage control, not protection, not prevention, not transparency. The decision to minimize the fallout risk wasn't based on scientific uncertainty. It was based on political calculus. Government-sponsored studies confirmed that radioactive fallout from U.S. nuclear tests was widespread, but the findings were framed as acceptable sacrifices in the pursuit of nuclear superiority. The weapons program was deemed too important to slow down, the image of national strength too valuable, the victims statistically acceptable. So the government tracked fallout, not to warn, but to measure, not to protect, but to prepare for lawsuits, and not to serve the public, but to control the narrative. Fallout wasn't just a scientific side effect. It was a secret to be managed, a PR threat to be contained. And the cost of keeping that secret was borne by communities like Troy, communities that were never told what was falling from the sky. In 1997, during a U.S. Senate hearing on Cold War radiation exposure, the full scope of this policy began to surface. Records showed how widespread fallout monitoring was, how often data was withheld, and how certain industries, like photographic manufacturing, received protection that everyday citizens did not. It was never about what they knew. It was about who they chose to tell. And Troy wasn't on that list. But Troy wasn't the only community to suffer the consequences of radioactive fallout. Across the country and even beyond U.S. borders, Other cities, towns, and rural regions became unintentional laboratories in America's nuclear experiment. In Utah, downwind of the Nevada test site, entire communities were exposed repeatedly. St. George, a quiet desert town, experienced radioactive clouds so dense that people reported tasting metal on their tongues. Sheep ranchers in the region lost entire herds to radiation poisoning. Thousands of lambs born still or grotesquely deformed. The government blamed disease. Years later, declassified documents revealed internal acknowledgement that fallout was the cause. In New Mexico, the first nuclear test, the Trinity explosion in 1945, released an enormous plume of radioactive debris. It drifted across rural areas inhabited primarily by Hispanic and indigenous communities. These people were never warned, never evacuated, and never studied. Decades later, a pattern of rare cancers and autoimmune diseases would emerge, leading these residents to call themselves the Forgotten Downwinders. The Marshall Islands, thousands of miles from the continental U.S., were the site of 67 nuclear detonations between 1946 and 1958. After the Castle Bravo test in 1954, larger than any ever conducted by the U.S., islands as far as 100 miles away were coated in snow-like fallout. Children played in it. People collected it in buckets, thinking it was ash from a nearby volcano. Weeks later, the burns and sickness began. Birth defects followed. Entire atolls were rendered uninhabitable. To this day, many Marshallese people live in exile from their ancestral lands, while others remain in contaminated zones with limited access to health care. Even in New York State, beyond Troy, fallout from Shot Simon and other tests registered across cities like Albany, Schroon Lake, and Buffalo. It showed up in snow samples, in rainwater, and even in the milk supply, part of a broader pattern that suggested radiation had infiltrated the daily lives of people far from any missile silo or test site. Internationally, fallout was detected across Scandinavia, Japan, and even the United Kingdom. Atmospheric tests carried out in the U.S., Soviet Union, and other nations effectively turned the skies into global vectors for contamination. By the late 1950s, scientists had begun finding strontium-90 in baby teeth across the globe. This wasn't just America's problem, it was the world's. The stories follow a pattern: exposure without warning, symptoms without acknowledgement, communities left to interpret sickness without science, and when questions arose, the response was the same: deny, delay, discredit. Troy was part of a larger map, one drawn not with borders, but with isotopes. But the impact was real. Fallout wasn't just a scientific phenomenon, it was a human one. The patterns emerged slowly, almost invisibly. They weren't plotted on government charts or tracked through systematic studies. They surfaced the way cold air creeps through an old window, subtle, constant, and only obvious once you stepped into it. There were no sirens when the fallout came, no warnings posted on telephone poles, no announcements on local radio stations urging people to stay indoors. The April rain fell as it always had, cool, steady, almost comforting after a long winter, and people did what they always did. Children played stickball in the streets until the first heavy drops drove them under porches. Gardeners welcomed the soak, believing it would bring a better growing season. Workers trudged home through puddles that reflected the fractured glow of street lamps, thinking only of warm kitchens and dry socks. No one knew that the water pooling in gutters, soaking into lawns, and sliding down rooftops carried radioactive isotopes from a bomb tested in a desert thousands of miles away. No one knew that with every breath of damp air, every mouthful of fresh milk, every leafy vegetable pulled from backyard gardens, the danger was accumulating, not in headlines, but in their own bodies. Over the next decade, patterns began to emerge, but in a city like Troy, working class, uncelebrated, politically expendable, there were no grand investigations, no epidemiological studies funded by the state, no task forces or special commissions sent to connect the dots between exposure and illness. There was only the day-to-day reality, and that's how the damage buried itself, not just in the marrow of bones, but in the marrow of memory. By the 1970s and 80s, stories piled up like sediment. People who had been children during that rainy spring now found themselves facing diagnoses they couldn't explain. Thyroid tumors, lymphomas, rare bone diseases. They asked questions, but the answers, when they came, were too late or too carefully worded to satisfy. The truth was never officially acknowledged. Troy's fallout wasn't studied, mapped, or memorialized. It was absorbed into silence. When the National Cancer Institute released its 1997 report, quietly linking radioactive iodine from nuclear testing to thyroid cancer across the country, there was no footnote for places like Troy. No specific recognition that the rain which had fallen here was carrying death stitched invisibly into every drop. But the people knew. They knew it in the gaps that couldn't be closed. And they carried that knowledge forward, not as a rallying cry, but as a private generational ache. Theirs was a story not of explosions and mushroom clouds, but of quiet erosion, of health stolen by degrees, of trust betrayed not with a gunshot, but with a shrug. The government didn't come to study what happened here, but the rain left its records. The soil held its testimony, the bones, the teeth, the cells. All archived the truth in a language that could not be erased by denial. And though the names of those lost may never appear in official histories, their lives remain written into the landscape. Fallout didn't announce itself. It didn't ask permission, and it didn't need a second chance. It came quietly, and it stayed, just as it stayed in Troy. As I worked on this story, I couldn't help but notice the pattern wasn't just historical. It's happening now, in different forms. The tools change, the science advances, the contaminants have new names, but the response, the institutional silence, the calculated indifference, feels eerily familiar. In Hoosick Falls, New York, residents were unknowingly drinking water laced with PFOA, a toxic chemical used in manufacturing that's now linked to cancer, liver damage, immune disorders, and developmental problems. The pollution came from a nearby plastics plant. It leaked into the groundwater, and for years people drank it, washed their dishes with it, bathed their kids in it. And for years, no one told them. Not the company, not the state, not the agencies meant to protect them. When residents started asking questions, they weren't met with urgency. They were met with silence. And later, when the facts became too loud to ignore, they were met with resistance, delay, denial, and then carefully worded damage control. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Or look beyond Hoosick Falls to a larger threat with a footprint so broad it's now global. PFAS, so-called forever chemicals, found in non-stick cookware, in food packaging, in rainwater, in the foam firefighters use to put out chemical fires, in some places in the air itself. These substances accumulate over time. They don't break down, they don't wash out, and they've been detected in the blood of nearly every American alive today. These forever chemicals are linked to the same health issues we now associate with radiation exposure: thyroid disease, weakened immunity, reproductive harm, certain cancers. And like radioactive fallout, they move silently through air, water, and time. They follow the same invisible vectors, and for decades their dangers were minimized by the companies that made them and the regulators who were supposed to keep them in check. The substances change, the names change, but the playbook does not. Quiet contamination, government delay, corporate secrecy, and people, real people, left to piece together the fragments of a crisis they never saw coming. Families just like those in Troy in 1953 are told their water is fine, their illnesses are coincidental, their fears unfounded, and if they push hard enough, maybe they'll get a press release, a study, an apology, all of it years too late. There's a haunting symmetry between the fallout of the Cold War and the environmental crises we're facing today. Both are invisible until they're undeniable. Both are denied until they're deadly. And both ask us to believe that some exposure is just the cost of doing business, the price of progress, the collateral damage of innovation. But here's the thing. History has already shown us what happens when we wait too long to ask the right questions. What happens when we defer to authority without scrutiny, when we trust systems over neighbors, when we choose short-term comfort over long-term consequences. The next time a warning is issued or isn't, when there's talk of, quote, acceptable levels, unquote, of thresholds and technicalities and things being within range, remember the rain that fell on Troy. Remember how it carried the residue of a weapon tested in secret and unleashed on a city that never got a choice. Remember that sometimes the danger doesn't come with a siren or a headline. Sometimes it falls quietly from the sky. Before we close today's episode, I want to leave you with an important note. This podcast is for informational purposes only. This podcast is based on historical research, declassified government documents, independent scientific studies, and public records. Restoration Obscura does not engage in conspiracy theories. We focus on verifiable history and documented evidence. It is not medical advice. It is not a substitute for professional health care. If you have concerns about radiation exposure, environmental toxins, or related health issues, please consult a qualified medical professional. Many of the examples you heard today, the voices of Troy, New York, come from my own long history with the city, from people I know and from the people they love. Their stories reflect real community memory, passed down and lived, not clinical studies and not official government data. Everything you've heard was researched and checked against credible scientific sources. Here's where that information comes from. Sources for this episode include A Good Day Has No Rain by Bill Heller, United States Senate hearings on Cold War radiation exposure, reports from the National Cancer Institute, declassified documents from the Atomic Energy Commission, environmental data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Environmental Protection Agency, studies from Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Argonne National Labs, meteorological research from the U.S. Weather Bureau, fallout tracking data from the Baby Tooth Survey, international findings from the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, independent investigations into the Kodak Agreement. All scientific names and measurements were verified using standards from the Health Physics Society and the International Atomic Energy Agency. This episode of Restoration Obscura is based on the best knowledge available at the time of recording. Where new research emerges, we'll update and acknowledge it. If you've been enjoying the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, our deep dives into forgotten history, lost infrastructure, and the echoes of the past, there's a way to be part of the story behind the scenes. We're currently welcoming select sponsorship partners for upcoming episodes and articles. Whether you're an independent brand, museum, publisher, archive, or just someone who believes in the power of storytelling, this is your chance to reach an engaged, history-loving audience across Substack, Facebook, Instagram, and all major streaming platforms. If your mission aligns with ours, preserving the past, exploring the overlooked, or just digging deeper than the headlines, we'd love to connect. For sponsor opportunities and media inquiries, contact restorationobscura@gmail.com. Let's bring more forgotten stories to light, together. You can subscribe to Restoration Obscura at restorationobscura.com. This podcast is copyright 2025 John Bulmer Media and Restoration Obscura. All rights reserved. No reuse, rebroadcast, or repurposing of any content is permitted without express written permission. The Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast is available on all major streaming platforms. If you enjoyed what you heard, please like and subscribe. It truly helps us reach more listeners. Thanks for listening. I'm John Bulmer, and remember, every photo has a story, and every story connects us. Until next time, take care.
This was a Restoration Obscura broadcast. Archive reference terminated. Operation complete. Restoration Obscura signing off.